Hello, this time on Sitrep.
I'm just here to try and get peace. I don't care so much about anything other than I want to stop having millions of people killed.
Donald Trump starts Ukraine talks with Vladimir Putin, but without President Zelensky. And the new US Defense Secretary tells Ukraine it can't get what it wants.
Returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome.
He also tells allies they will have to pick up the pieces as the US steps back from Europe.
To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine. Stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe.
So, a lot of threads to unravel here. What is the battlefield picture right now, and what does that tell us about whether it makes sense for Ukraine to talk instead? Has the US just given away Ukraine's strongest bargaining chip? And as the UK Defence Secretary takes the lead vacated by the US at the Ukraine Contact Group, could we and should we step into America's shoes at NATO too?
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
There are two ways you could look at Pete Hegseth's debut performance at NATO HQ. One is a combat veteran using the basic tactic of walk in, blow stuff up. The other is tough love, but we can't say we weren't warned, can we?
No, Kate. I mean, we've wondered for the last 2 or 3 months. We said, would the Trump administration really roll over to Putin? Would they really just give in? Or surely, they would be tough with Putin if only to show that they could negotiate something important. And at the moment, in these opening exchanges, certainly to the Europeans, it looks as if they're going to roll over. Because it was astonishing to me yesterday, Pete Hegseth comes in without any prior warning, without any consultation, in public. He sits down and all the NATO allies are sitting there waiting to hear what he says. And in public, he basically pulls the rug from under NATO's policy for the last 3 years, in public. And that suggests that the United States is taking a very different view, not just of the Ukrainian crisis, but NATO. And I think NATO took a body blow yesterday, which is the greatest it has taken since its foundation in 1949.
Yeah, and I said there are a lot of threads to unravel. Let's start at NATO headquarters in Brussels, which is where the US Defence Secretary gave that uncompromising speech to the Ukraine Contact Group, which coordinates military support. Sitrep Simon Newton is there. Simon, hi. As you and I speak, NATO defence ministers are meeting, having a little under 24 hours to digest not just what Secretary Hegseth said, but then Donald Trump's announcement that he's effectively started talks with President Putin. How's it all going down there?
Well, I think for everybody here, it feels like we're sort of back to the good old days of a Trump presidency, where you just your head's spinning. Really, you just can't keep up with all the various narratives and threads that are going on. We've obviously got the Trump Putin talks. We've got the Pete Hegseth things from yesterday, as you said. We've had the Treasury Secretary, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Kyiv talking to Zelensky about money. So there's all this going on at the same time. Mark Rutte was asked this morning, the Secretary General of NATO, as he arrived this morning, whether this actually marked a betrayal of Ukraine. He batted that question away, but that is very much the discussions that are going on, I think. And as you say, to go off the bat and say, as the Americans have done, that there'll be no membership of NATO, they'll have to cede territory, there'll be no US troops on Ukrainian soil. And then we had President Trump last night also mentioning the idea of elections in Ukraine, which is something that President Putin has mentioned many times. So, there's lots going on here. There'll be plenty of smiles, I'm sure, at the photo call later on this morning. But I think behind those, there's significant disquiet.
Yeah, and we should not forget the fighting continues and the military picture matters here. I just want to play a bit of what John Healey said as chair of the Ukraine Contact Group after the meeting.
Ukraine walks away from this meeting backed by members of this group, backed by billions of dollars worth of arms and ammunition committed today to keep their warfighters equipped in order to help increase pressure on Putin.
You know, Simon, I was watching him say that and I really felt for him at that moment. Two things stand out there. Number one, he seemed to really be trying to drive a message that Ukraine still has moral and practical support. And number two, talking about billions of dollars of arms and ammunition committed today. Billions sounds a lot, but we know Ukraine needs everything it can get. Have you been able to get any detail on what that's going to deliver to them?
So I think billions are a lot, but in the context of Ukraine, they're not a great deal of money. I mean, so in terms of the details, the specifics of what's going, we did have John Healey talking about the UK providing an extra 150 million, which is part of this 3 billion package that the UK is giving, which includes these drones and some more air defence. The UK unveiled, which I actually saw this week, this new Grey Hawk air defence system that we're going to be giving to Ukraine, which actually uses Soviet-made missiles. But I mean, to put this into context, the Russians spent $462 billion last year on their military and on defence, which is just actually more than the whole of Europe spent. And we've had this warning today from the Danish intelligence agency that Russia is preparing for war with NATO within 5 years. So there is big picture stuff going on.
We'll come back to you in a minute, Simon. Mike, Ukraine gets a say in all of this, of course. Even if Donald Trump and President Putin have shut Kyiv out so far, we've talked many times before about how wars generally end up at the negotiating table once both sides decide they've got more to gain there than on the battlefield. So can you give us an overview of the battlefield picture as it stands at the moment, and then how much scope Ukraine has to improve its position?
Well, the battlefield hasn't changed as much as we thought it might by now, because although the Russians have thrown everything into it, they have not. They've taken Turetsk in the south, but they haven't taken Pokrovsk. They've surrounded it, and it's a ruin, but they haven't taken it. They haven't taken Chasiv Yar, even though those places are very vulnerable. So the Ukrainians are still holding on desperately in the south. They haven't lost all that much more territory a bit further north, and the Ukrainians have actually improved their position in the Kursk pocket. So compared to, say, 2 or 3 weeks ago, the situation on the ground hasn't altered all that much, and we're coming now, as it were, out of the winter, where the Ukrainians will be better off in terms of their energy supply, with constant Russian attacks on their energy supply overnight, with all these air attacks, will be a bit less effective. So Ukrainians, in theory, could carry on. And we've always said, if they could carry on through the rest of this year, their position would be better, in the sense that Russia's position gets considerably worse into 2025-26. If the Russians are still fighting and devoting so much of their economy, the economy that they've bent out of shape, if they have to do that for another 12 months, then there will be serious problems for them if the Ukrainians could keep them fighting that long. But they may not be able to stay in the fight if the Americans are going to pull the plug.
And let's pause for a moment to get the thoughts now of General Sir Richard Shirreff, formerly Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for NATO. When we spoke, it was shortly before the statements from the US Defence Secretary and President, but we focused on the military picture, how that might affect negotiations, and who has the battlefield momentum right now.
The balance of power. I mean, Russia has got the advantage, but it's hurting. Russia is continuing to take ground incrementally, bit by bit, at vast cost in terms of its manpower. I mean, if you think of on the current trajectory of Russian casualties, by the 9th of May, the day that Russia celebrates its so-called Victory Day every year, Russia will have suffered 1 million casualties, wounded and killed in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. And Ukraine is at the same time hurting. It's no question about it. They've suffered significant casualties, not on the scale of Russia. And Ukraine is finding it very difficult to stem that Russian incremental advance. But on the other hand, Ukraine still has a sizable chunk of Kursk province in Russia and has been mounting successful counterattacks against the Russians. So it's not all going Russia's way. But I think the real issue is the sense in the West among people, frankly, I think, who should know better, that ultimately Ukraine cannot prevail. And I think that is the underlying current which will colour the Munich Security Conference and potential announcements about Trump deals and the like.
And the narrative has clearly shifted since the US election to focus on getting Ukraine to a point where it has the best hand possible to play in negotiations. Can it still do more militarily to strengthen that hand?
Well, it could, absolutely, but it would require NATO, the West, and Ukraine's partners to adopt a strategy that says that we will support Ukraine defeat Russia. And so it needs a step change, a huge fundamental step change, which I think is essential, but I think it's highly unlikely.
The latest assessment from the International Institute for Strategic Studies says Ukraine is suffering a more serious drain on personnel than Russia. That is something we can't help them with. So is there a danger if they choose to continue to fight rather than talk, as is entirely their right, that they will be past their high water mark, that their negotiating position will just get worse?
There is that chance. And Ukraine, I mean, that's absolutely right. Ukraine has got a manpower issue. And I would love to see a combined effort by the West to give Ukraine the means to defeat Russia, but also a deep internal look at Ukraine. Some tough decisions have to be made about mobilization. They've made a number of decisions about mobilization. But at the end of the day, Ukraine faces an existential threat. And as happened in 1939 in this country, when we faced an existential threat, the only solution really was a full-scale national effort, which involved universal male conscription. So, Ukraine needs to do some tough thinking itself if it is to achieve any form of victory over Russia. But that's a long way off. So meanwhile, yes, of course, it is entirely up to Ukraine, the decisions it makes about whether it talks to Russia and what sort of deal it's prepared to do. It's interesting to hear this morning on the news that Zelensky is saying that he is prepared to trade land with Russia, and the fact is that he's got, as I said earlier, a bit of a chunk of Kursk province in Russia, so he has got some cards to play. And it's also interesting to hear how the discussions about rare minerals and rare earths, which Ukraine holds as a potential, which could be part of a potential deal to keep the Americans on board.
And if Ukraine were to solicit your advice right now, what would it be? Time to talk or keep fighting?
Well, it's up to Ukraine, and they're not going to ask me. But what I would say is that the only thing that's going to stop Russia, and I mean long term, is defeat. Ultimately, Russia has got to be forced into recognizing that it's never going to be able to achieve its aims in Ukraine. Meanwhile, unless that happens, even if there's some sort of deal, some sort of ceasefire deal in the next few weeks or months, unless Russia will never give up, will not give up its intent to remove Ukraine from the map as a sovereign state and to reincorporate it into a Russian empire. So my fear is that if there's a sort of deal that doesn't force Russia into that recognition that it has failed, forces Russia into an acceptance of significant security guarantees to Ukraine, which ultimately means NATO membership, and forces Russia to accept a sizable implementation force that overmatches Russia and in order to enforce the ceasefire and makes it quite impossible for Russia to have another go, then Russia will have another go in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, when it's rebuilt, regained, retrained, and regenerated its armed forces.
That was General Sir Richard Shirreff there. Mike, we should look at the other side of the coin, shouldn't we? Does Russia have more to gain from fighting than it does from talking right now?
Oh, no, it has a lot more to gain now by talking. And this is the ideal time for Russia to cash in on what it's got so far in order to take a breath, as Sir Richard says, and before it comes back for the next go, which will be the third go. Remember, this is the second war it's launched against Ukraine, and there will be a third war. But the idea of a pause now to give them let's say, control over 5 provinces. They had Crimea already. The other 4 provinces, they don't control any of those 4 provinces completely. And the deal they'll be looking for is to have full control over those 4 provinces and a release from some or all sanctions, and that's what they'll push for, quite a lot of other sweeteners, and then the chance to have a breathing space. So this is exactly the right time for the Russians to cash in on what they have spent on the war, and take stock, take a breath, and then give themselves a chance of coming back in a couple of years' time.
Well, let's go back to Simon. Simon, General Sir Richard thinks Ukraine can still strengthen its hand with military action if it has enough support, and that means everything from tanks to artillery shells and field dressings. Do we have any clarity on what is going to happen and when to US supplies, given the statement from Pete Hegseth that European nations are going to have to provide the overwhelming share of aid to Ukraine going forward?
I think the short answer is no, but primarily because we just don't know what the timescale is, and we don't know whether he's going to just turn the tap, entirely off, or whether it's going to become a trickle of aid over the coming months or so. They have some existing commitments that the US has made. If you remember, President Biden was obviously well aware that this scenario was going to arise, so he tried to put down this. He had this drawdown fund, about $46 billion that was approved by Congress. There's about $3.8 billion of that apparently left allocated for Ukraine, but not spent as such. So that's less than 10% of that money, and that will go pretty quickly, and Trump could potentially put brakes on that. In terms of the kit, the last batch of material to go apparently was air defense missiles and rockets for systems like HIMARS, and that there are, we understand, some old APCs, American APCs, and some trucks that are still in transit to Ukraine, but that's pretty much it. And obviously the other big question is the huge role America's played in coordinating all of this military aid to Ukraine, both politically and physically. Now, they've done the heavy lifting. Who oversees this logistics if the Americans pull out? Who looks after that supply chain? Will British troops, for instance, have to take a much bigger part in moving some of this material through Europe, Poland into Ukraine? It's whatever. It's all up in the air at the moment.
And Simon, presumably the rest of the defence ministers meeting there now are going to be trying to work out how much they can fill the gaps going forward.
Yes, so they're going to discuss this new defence production action plan, which is designed to ramp up production across the alliance. We know, obviously, that the Europeans provide the vast majority of financial assistance to Ukraine, but the Americans provide by far the largest supplies of actual kit and equipment, almost double what the Europeans have actually sent. President Trump last night was talking about them having sent $350 billion, which seems a lot of money. The figure we use is around $66 billion of actual kit and equipment. And obviously, that's a very big hole for the Europeans to try and fill. Europe has stepped up its ammunition production, for instance. It's doubled that since the war began. But on things like armor, tanks, America has the deep stocks of those. They sent 31 Abrams to Ukraine, 200 Bradleys to Ukraine. They've even sent 45 T-72s, I understand, and all spare parts for that. We've had Patriot, NASAMS, ATACMS, all that stuff. So, it was no coincidence that we saw the UK unveiling this new Grey Hawk air defence system yesterday during the contact group. So a lot of discussions undoubtedly going on here on how NATO nations can fill this void if the US vacates, the Ukraine war.
All right, Simon in Brussels, we'll let you go. Thank you for that. Mike, let's look at the diplomatic realities here. What happens next? Fighting isn't going to stop anytime soon, is it?
No, there'll be this summit in Saudi Arabia, so-called, between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, and that will look like an old Cold War summit of two leaders, and everyone else will be frozen out, it seems. And there's an old phrase in diplomacy that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. And Ukraine is certainly on the menu, but so is the rest of Europe. We are now all on the menu for this meeting between the two big, really imperialist leaders. And, there's something else which is really important here. Trump announced yesterday who his negotiating team would be. And that negotiating team will be Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, John Radcliffe, the director of the CIA, and Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, who was involved in Gaza. I mean, he's got no political background, but Trump obviously trusts him. That's his 4-person negotiating team. It does not include Keith Kellogg, who was the man he set off as a special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, because Keith Kellogg had what most of us would regard as a more realistic plan for safeguards for Ukraine and a more balanced approach. And the fact that Kellogg is not in this team tells me that Trump doesn't want to get involved at all in any follow-ups. That it does look, at the moment, I mean, Trump can turn on a sixpence, so this is not set in stone, but it does look as if he's going to roll over to Putin's demands, because these people that I've just mentioned, apart from Marco Rubio, who knows a little bit about international politics, but Mike Waltz, John Radcliffe, Steve Witkoff are, in international political terms, complete amateurs. And these people will be backing up Trump in a one-to-one negotiation with Putin. And to be honest, in negotiating terms, Putin will just take Trump to the cleaners. Trump will be lucky to come out of that meeting in his underwear. And so it does.
Thanks for
it
that
really
picture.
doesn't look. Sorry, but it really doesn't look very good as things stand at the moment. They could change, of course they could, but as things stand at the moment, it doesn't look very good at all.
Yeah, it's quite bleak, isn't it? And the key question of NATO membership for Ukraine, Mike, the alliance had said it was on an unbreakable path to membership. The US seems to have taken a hammer to that path. Has it also deprived Ukraine of perhaps its biggest bargaining chip?
Yes. Once this war had started, the unthinkable was that Ukraine could someday come into NATO, which I always thought was a very, very distant prospect. Ukraine and Georgia coming into NATO, I always thought was something that would be very difficult to envisage. But once the war had started in 2022, suddenly that seemed like the only feasible line of thinking that would give Ukraine some real security for the future. So yes, it takes away the one thing that Ukraine could feel secure behind, some sort of clear NATO membership and Article 5 guarantee. And more than that, it deals, as I said at the beginning, a hammer blow to NATO itself, because it now looks as if the United States really is detaching itself from European NATO. And if I was in Moscow, and my old friend, as was, Sergei Karaganov, has said this sort of thing in Moscow for some time now. He's an advisor to the Kremlin. He said, look, you could hit the Europeans and the US won't react. Article 5 doesn't apply anymore, not in reality. That's what he's been saying. And I think as of today, I think a lot of people in Moscow will start to say that, because the Americans are detaching themselves from the European side of NATO. And you have to ask yourself, what would it take now to make the United States stand with its European allies in the event of an attack?
Well, let's dig some more, Mike, into that clear statement that the US is stepping back considerably from European defence. The position is not a surprise, and you said so yourself from what you were told by the former Kremlin advisor. It's not just President Trump who's told us over the last couple of decades that we Europeans need to do much more for our own defence. But this feels like that moment a teenager is told, right, move out, get yourself a job.
Yes. And I mean, that side of the message, I think those of us in the defence business have agreed with for a long time. The Europeans have not had a free ride in NATO. It's not that they're just on America's back all the time, but they needed to do more. We've had the peace dividend since 1991. We've spent it, but that peace dividend has been over now for almost 10 years. And so it's time to get back to realistic levels of defence spending, which has been something more like 4 and 5% of our budgets, which is what we were spending at the end of the Cold War. And I go back to what I've said many times. During the teeth of the Cold War, and the future is going to feel much more like that, we were spending about 7% on defence. So the time to, as it were, think differently is now. And the Trump administration, the Americans in general, are not wrong when they say that. And those of us in the defence business have always recognised that. But of course, the danger of making that the be-all and end-all is that the Americans are now throwing out the baby with the bathwater and effectively dismantling NATO for the sake of the money involved in defence expenditure.
Think differently, but what does that mean in terms of practical reality? It's not just spending more to buy more stuff, is it?
No, it's about more integration. We run far too many different systems in NATO. NATO itself runs something like, I think it's 150 different systems, whereas the Americans, who have forces twice as big as those of NATO, run about 50 systems. We need far fewer systems. We need to grasp this issue of not duplicating what we do for the sake of our national industries, and get back to the idea of the fact that, look, we are 12 times, in Europe alone, we are 12 times richer than Russia, just without the United States. With the United States, we're 20 times richer than Russia. But even on our own, we are 12 times richer than Russia. So what do we have to do to make that count in defence terms, to spend our money much more efficiently and in a less protectionist way in order to get what we want? And we've already left it too late to rearm, but now we need to rearm as best we can with completely new thinking about innovation, new systems and war stocks.
Well, the UK was in a very interesting position at the moment. The US Defence Secretary said European allies must lead from the front. Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey was chairing that meeting of the Ukraine Contact Group, a role previously always taken by the US. It was symbolic, both that the US step back has already begun and that the UK is stepping up. But how many steps up might we and can we take? I've been talking to another retired British officer who once held NATO's second most powerful military post, Deputy Supreme Allied Commander General Sir James Everard.
And I think the UK chairing the Ukraine Defence Contact Group is evidence of this American approach playing out. UK is a very trusted partner. We've been a leading light, extremely solid on Ukraine. And so I think we are the obvious nation to step forward and chair this meeting, which I think this time, I'm told, has about 56 participants. So it's big.
So you are persuaded then that this is about the US choosing to step back in this particular instance. It's not about any concern within the contact group about a Trump-led US in the driving seat.
No, and I was listening very carefully to the comments UK Defence Secretary was speaking in Germany very recently, making the point that they want to see nations, Europe, standing up for its own defence, but they remain firmly in support. And I think this is a really good example of this playing out. And I think that's probably a model for the future.
And do you think this is something, you say model for the future, do you think this is something that could be repeated perhaps within NATO?
So I can't see, the whole North Atlantic Treaty, its primary purpose was to give the US a seat at the European security table. I can't see the US wanting to relinquish its leadership role in the alliance. The Supreme Allied Commander, that link to, US weight of combat power, everything, that's a very powerful working model. But I do think they want to see Europeans doing more. And if you follow, the debate, one of the things I think that Saka will be doing in the ministerial is briefing ministers on where he's got to in the implementation of that new force employment strategy that they agreed. And he has very clearly laid out the minimum force requirements. He needs to deliver that. And, we're not there yet. And Europe needs to do more. And he'll make that very clear, I think.
So that position that Britain routinely holds of the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the one that you held, that is something that you think will be enough and will be sustained for the future? Yes, I think it will be. I think UK talk, don't we, a very strong message about being the leading European member of NATO. I think words have to be underpinned by deeds, and deeds in the alliance is about a military capacity and strength and that ability to take decisions and then follow through on them. UK have a good track record on that, and one will hope that continues into the future. But you're right. I think that other allies, particularly the US, are going to be more demanding on all allies, including the UK, than they have been in the past. And what about other countries like France, also in nuclear power, Germany, now the biggest European defence spender? Yeah. Well, if you work in NATO, these big nations are the ones you need to carry. Yes, NATO meets and it agrees by consensus, but the big nations, are the ones whose opinions carry a lot of weight. And so, the US have to make sure that
as they lead up to the summit, which is where they'll want to have a good display of unity in June, that they've brought these allies with them. And I'm sure the Defence Secretary, Heathcliff, will be carrying messages to allies about the need to increase defence spending and do more for their own security.
And should we be pushing ourselves forward to fill any gap left by the US?
Well, I don't think we know what those gaps are yet. And of course, one has to have the capacity to do that. And I think there are still significant shortfall areas in the military capabilities that the alliance needs. And that's before the US potentially reduce their contribution.
And when the old saying goes, lead by example, have we got the military clout to do that? Because that's what's given the US the political power to do things like lead the Ukraine contacts group until now.
So I think this is it's a big question for the ongoing defence review, isn't it? Where do you focus the weight of combat power that you have in order to gain, both the best military but also political advantage? And I'm very pleased, clearly as I would be, having worked in NATO and still working for NATO, that NATO first appears to be a theme that is going to emerge very strongly out of the defence review. And I think we have the combat power to lead strongly in the alliance, which is what I would like to see us do.
General Sir James Everard, great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Mike, is there going to be some jockeying for position with the likes of France and Germany, given we already have the prestige and influence of Deputy Supreme Allied Commander? Or actually, is it a poisoned chalice which they're happy to leave with us?
Yes, well, they may be in the immediate future, because it is a poison chalice just at the moment. But I think, Sir James Everard, he's a very savvy observer of these things, and he was putting it very carefully in that interview just now. The fact is that Britain can take on this greater leadership role, but it's got to have forces itself which are taken seriously by its European allies. So, yeah, we have the structures. We are a framework nation. We've got the headquarters that can link things together. We can work on a continental basis, on a global basis. Not many nations can really do that. And we have forces that can be projected, both, on the continent and further afield and into the North Atlantic. So we tick a lot of boxes, but we only make the first tick. That's the problem, that we're all, as we've said before, everything we have is in the shop window and there's not much in the stockroom. And so until our NATO allies see that we can have real strategic effect with our forces, then our ability to lead is a bit limited. And so I think we're on probation, put it that way. I mean, at one time, no one would have doubted the importance of a British leadership role in this sort of thing. But now, I guess I'd say we're on probation to prove that we can do what we've always claimed we can do.
OK, so we're on probation. Simon mentioned the logistics of getting kit to Ukraine. They're looking ahead to the possibility of peacekeeping troops. Is that going to land on the UK, to lead with boots on European ground? I mean, are we still on probation there, or will we be asked anyway?
We probably will be asked. And could we do it? Yes, we could. We could have some. But the problem is we could have peacekeeping troops in the way that UN peacekeepers are observers. They monitor what's going on and report back what's going on. But could they, as it were, preserve the line? If somebody attacked them, either side, if they penetrated a line of a demilitarized zone, could our forces push them back? Would they be prepared to? The answer is probably not. I mean, would we have enough stuff there to actually allow our forces to enforce the line of control or just observe it? Yes, we could observe it on a fair part of the front, although it would be a very long front. But could we enforce it? No, we couldn't.
Well, this puts even more pressure on the government over defence spending and investment, doesn't it? But that doesn't mean they can or will deliver it.
No, we're waiting for the defence review, which can't be long delayed now. And the vibes in Whitehall are that the spending arguments are still very vibrant in the sense that are we going to go to 2.5% of our GDP quite soon? And we're going to have to go a fair way beyond that by most calculations. It looks as if the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are digging in at 2.3% for now, for the rest of this year. If they do, that will send a message to our allies that we talk a better game than we play. And we'll see. There will be a financial statement at the end of March, and then there'll be a spending review in the autumn. But I think as things are working out in Ukraine, if we don't say something dramatic by the end of March, then I think our allies will form their own conclusions about our commitment.
Now, before we finish, we should talk about an imminent event that's had a couple of mentions today, the Munich Security Conference. This is an annual event. It's run effectively by a private foundation. It's not G20 or United Nations, and yet it's a big deal. Mike, some of the world's most consequential conversations and agreements happen here.
They do these days, yeah. The old MSC, it goes back to the 1960s. I think it was about 1963 or 64 it began. And it was very much an academic view. It was a sort of security version of Davos, but without the glamour for many, many years. And then in the 90s, it became a sort of an EU security conference, because they always talked about integration. I remember there's a famous case in, I think it was 1996, when Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, made a big pitch about the need for integrated security, and everybody shrugged their shoulders and said, oh yes, well, wouldn't that be nice, and so on. And the conference really came alive in 2007. Everybody remembers this one, when Vladimir Putin, who'd been in power for 7 years, turned up and was very angry at the idea of NATO enlargement to the countries of the former Soviet empire. And people didn't take him very seriously, and perhaps they should have. And that actually created a bigger sense that what was said at Munich was really important. And then, in 2021, Joe Biden was there talking about the importance of transatlantic security. And in 2022, just after the invasion of Ukraine, Zelensky was there. There were standing ovations. There were big declarations that this was Europe's moment. They would stand up. They would do everything in their power, everything required to make sure that Putin failed and that Ukraine would succeed in repelling this invasion. And here we are 3 years later, waiting to hear how much the Americans are going to withdraw from Ukraine and possibly from NATO itself.
And Mike, you have been. What is Davos without the glamour like?
Well, yeah, it's like a big academic conference in one sense, but as it gets bigger, so it's full of little side groups and discussion panels. So it's like a party conference in a way. There's the main hall, the plenary, but then there's lots and lots going on around the outside. And so it's a place for conversations and networking, as they call it. And then everybody rushes into the big plenaries, and you can always tell those speakers who don't attract a full house. It's pretty obvious that nobody really cares what they think about things one way or another. But when you've got the big names, I mean, the plenary is absolutely packed, and their staffs are moving around addressing other side meetings. So it has become a sort of a marketplace of ideas. But it's now also a marketplace of political statements. And the Munich Security Conference is, in a way, it's almost like a United Nations for security. It's more efficient than the UN because it involves, as it were, transatlantic and European security in a series of fairly directed conversations, not always encouraging, and sometimes it's quite annoying, but it actually it has become an important conduit now of thinking.
And to that point, the US Vice President J.D. Vance and Ukraine's President Zelensky will meet at the Munich Security Conference. We've also heard rumours that maybe the first details of any US peace plan might be revealed there. Why at a privately organised conference in Munich rather than, say, the NATO contact group meeting a few days before?
Yeah, I think that's because it gives the opportunity to try something out. I mean, this in a way is is a sort of compensation for the damage that's been done so far this week. I mean, the conference begins tomorrow. Keith Kellogg will be there, who looks, as I said, to be frozen out of the negotiating team. And his original plan was the one they were working to, but everybody will be concentrated on what J.D. Vance has got to say. And I suspect that J.D. Vance will say pretty well what Pete Hegseth has said. We don't know, but probably. And I think they're just using this as the opportunity to push the idea across a whole series of forums. And also, it reflects the fact that the Trump administration does not like dealing through international organizations. They just don't like it. They like to deal bilaterally, just like the Russians, just like the Chinese. They like to use their power bilaterally. And so doing something in this sort of forum means that they don't have to do it through the institution of NATO with its conventions and courtesies and so on. So it allows them to be more direct and in a way more impactful.
So, Mike, just a final thought on Ukraine. From this side of the Atlantic, it's hard not to look at this and draw comparisons with 2020, when the first Trump administration agreed a peace deal for Afghanistan with the Taliban, with no involvement from Afghanistan's government. And we all know how that went. But, Mike, we shouldn't assume that this will go the same way at any point in the process, should we?
No, we shouldn't. History doesn't repeat itself in that way. But I mean, what happened in 2020 is that Donald Trump gave the Taliban all they wanted and then went to negotiate with them. In other words, he told them that the US would be leaving, which is what they wanted, and the Taliban are nothing if not patient. And then he sat down and negotiated a few paper details, which they were very happy to agree to because they had no intention of keeping to them, which they didn't. And so far, in the last 24 hours, it looks as if he's about to do the same. He looks as if he's about to give Putin everything he wants, and then he'll go to negotiation in Saudi Arabia and agree a few paper details, which Putin will agree to because he has no intention of sticking to them. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I have to say the sort of dizzying events of the last 24 hours have an eerily similar look. I mean, this is President Trump's version of the art of the deal. You know, give the other side everything they want, make it look all right on paper, and then walk away and do something else. It's because he doesn't care about it. I mean, he wouldn't do this if he were negotiating on trade with China, which he does care about. But because he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine, because he didn't care what happened in Afghanistan, because he doesn't really care what happens in Taiwan or the South China Sea, he's prepared to give the opposition everything they want and walk away because he wants to concentrate on the things he does care about. And those things he does care about are strictly trade-based economics.
In the nicest possible way, Mike, I really do hope you're wrong. Thank you very much, though, for your thoughts this week, as ever. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.